Welcome to the Repro Files, where infertility meets injustice and nothing is off limits.
We're two nurses. We're certified reproductive health advocates, and we're here to tell you everything they didn't.
From the broken systems to the heartbreak left behind, we're here to connect the facts, the policies, and the pain.
Because silence isn't safety, and we're done being quiet.
This is the Repro Files.
Infertility, injustice, and all things nobody warned you about.
And we are back. Welcome back to the Repro Files, where we explore infertility care, injustice, and the systems that are shaping reproductive medicine today. I'm Elizabeth. As always, with me is AnnMarie Luft. And today, hello. Today we move sort of beyond clinical IVF and dive into something far more complex and troubling. So the other night, AnnMarie, I texted you sort of in shock at a recent New York Times Magazine investigation that exposed the really, really dark and awful sides of surrogacy, where it intersects with trafficking and exploitation and systemic abuse. And so this episode is here to unpack what we do know, what it kind of means clinically and ethically, and what the reproductive medicine community really is going to be forced to confront.
Right. So before we go any deeper, we should kind of clear up some things. For example, what is surrogacy? So clinically, surrogacy is an arrangement where a woman carries a pregnancy for intended parents. So of course, we in the fertility world, we all have our acronyms. So IP, intended parents, GC, gestational carrier is what we normally use. There are gestational surrogacy, and that is where the surrogate, the carrier, has no genetic link to the baby. And then there's traditional surrogacy where she does. So she provides the egg and the uterus. So in most modern clinical practices, gestational arrangements predominate. So meaning that they are not genetically linked to the baby. I know that there are some states that do not allow traditional surrogacy. I was in a state where they did not allow traditional surrogacy at one point. So I didn't even really know how that worked. I am currently in a state that does allow traditional surrogacy. I have not worked in a clinic where I've set up a traditional surrogacy, so I really don't even know how to even set up a treatment cycle for that. I'm very hesitant with traditional surrogacy because there are so many legalities to things. There are states that allow traditional surrogacy, but then they also allow, after the birth of a child, that the genetic reclaim their child because they have a biological link to that child. So it gets kind of messy. It's a little sticky. That's why many clinics, either they don't do them, they don't allow them, or they just kind of go with like more of the gestational surrogacy, where there's legal contracts involved. There's a psychological consultations that not only the intended parents have to do individually as themselves, as a couple, or as a single person. And the gestational carrier also meets with a psychological consult, whether that be a social worker or a psychologist. They do their individual consult, and then they meet as a group and they do a group. So there's a lot of different aspects that they need to talk about in who's going to be there for the transfer, who's going to be there in the delivery room. Are they going to allow certain things during their pregnancy? Are they requiring a certain diet? Are they, travel? These are all things that have to be taken into consideration. And sometimes it gets, even very minute things, but also big things that they have to talk about. For example, reduction. These are things that, they need to work out that through their psychological consultation, which then goes into their legal contracts. So legal contracts can go back and forth. They have to be done before any treatment begins. And not only that, but you have an attorney for the intended parents, you have an attorney for the gestational carrier, and they cannot have the same attorney. Yeah, they have to have different attorneys because they need to have their own representation in that contract, so it can go back and forth, allowing, hey, we want to do that. the gestational carrier says, no, I want to do this. And then they kind of go back and forth until a final arrangement is made. And then once legal contracts are signed, that's usually the last thing that needs to be done. So I kind of just went off on a long explanation, but
No, you did a great job, though, setting the stage for what a gestational carrier situation might look like in the US. The modern clinical practice of gestational surrogacy. You just explained sort of what that would look like. And so I think what was astounding about, and what you just kind of touched on with the importance of the psychological piece to help folks understand the anticipation of how they might respond to certain things, or there is this negotiation that takes place that is of mutual respect for both parties, both the intended parents and the gestational carrier. Where this starts to get very dicey, and where the UN comes into play, and where this episode sort of heads, is a warning. It comes as a warning from international human rights groups that commercial surrogacy arrangements can meet the definition for trafficking, um, when women are being recruited through economic pressures or deception. And even in most commercial surrogacy arrangements in the US, there's a significant commercial compensation for the gestational carrier. It's not a small amount of money. And I think you could easily argue that some women may go forward with being a gestational carrier solely because they need the money. And that's the first tension that I think we need to grapple with, is because this has to do with, gamete donation as well, egg and sperm donation. Where does reproductive choice kind of end and it become something like exploitation? Because I mean, I saw egg donors that, I mean, most of them seem to be very altruistically linked to the mission. But I think that there were also donors over the years that maybe would have never gone that route had there not been a financial component to it. And so I think you and I always do a good job at teasing out the nuance, because it's not really black or white. I mean, if we're using deception, that's black and white. That's not, that's if we're using significant economic pressures, right? But beyond that, yeah, like where does reproductive choice end? It becomes something like exploitation.
yeah, I mean, I definitely over the years have seen donors that, yes, they want to help couples, create families, but they also have student loans to pay off. They also have things that they want to do, travel that they want to do. So, I agree. Without that, payment for that, I don't know if they would become egg donors for some of
Yeah,
them. Yeah. And same with the carriers as well. I think a lot of them, yes, they want to help families because a gestational carrier must have had a child, right? Like the most
right.
clinics, they require them to have already had children in case something goes wrong during their gestational carrier arrangement and they lose their uterus, things like that. That is things that they have children. That's why many times, it is not allowed to go through a gestational carrier with who did not have a child themselves. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah. So, I think, some gestational carriers, yes, they have that altruistic. And I think that is a difference between, oh, you're going to have a family member or a friend who's going to carry for me versus, oh, I'm going to go to an agency and find a gestational carrier as well. There are many altruistic carriers out there that came from agencies, but they also are helping to support their families too.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, I mean, there is such an altruistic component. So many surrogates that I've met over the years,
Hmm.
they felt it was a great privilege and honor to be able to do something like that for somebody else. And yet, when it starts to become dicey, when, I think sometimes, like, I don't know how I feel necessarily about, like, well, once you do the transfer, you get this amount of money. And then once you do this, you get this amount of money. Like, we don't sell organs, right? I mean, we don't, can you sell a kidney? That's a silly question to ask, like, on live on a podcast, but
I
I
don't
don't
think
think
so.
you can, right?
I mean, the
So,
only thing I know you get paid for is like what, plasma? I can get
right,
plasma.
yeah.
I get
Yeah, but
20
no,
bucks at the blood donor place.
yeah, so I guess you can get paid to donate blood, from what I know from running FDA programs on the topic. is that once you get paid for it, it's a different sort of scenario. Anyway, but yeah, I think that when in the absence of some of those guardrails, and even still, there can become disputes and it can become a contested situation. But I think what we're really focusing on here is what it can look like to find yourself in an exploitative situation. I had been asked a couple weeks ago by the head of a very popular national women's group what my thoughts were on surrogacy, and my initial reaction was to respond to my thoughts on what you and I just described as the sort of clinical standard of care in the US today for surrogacy, not this dark, awful underbelly of exploiting women for reproductive purposes, which is just completely astonishing. And that's why I sent you that article.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that we being here and the clinics that we work with and all the people that we work with, we see it as like, wow, it's such an amazing thing. We've had the pleasure of working with so many wonderful people,
Yeah.
so many patients, intended parents, gestational carriers, everybody that we look at it from a positive light. And you forget when you leave that little bubble, things
Mhm.
can gonna go
Then,
sideways.
I mean, even living I mean, we're born and raised Americans. I mean, we don't have exposure to a lot of the depravity that is seen around the world. I mean, we're very fortunate in that manner, and that's where, our freedom is so coveted because we don't have that type of exposure. But yeah, so
So yeah, so this Times article that you sent me that I read, and I was just like, wow, it kind of was like a eye-opening type of thing. And getting these stories together of these women, in places like Thailand, Georgia, the country, not the state, and other many other countries, these women traveled thousands of miles only to find themselves trapped in these exploitive reproductive arrangements. In some instances, the women reported being misled about the intended parents or even their roles, or they never met them. They're just like, here, report your period, and here's some pills, and here's some injections, and okay. And they don't understand the language because these doctors do not speak their language. And they just do things and they're like, I don't know what just happened. Even though these women try to get translation like on Google Translate and things like that, and they basically shut them down.
yeah. I mean, the entire thing is disturbing. I'd say particularly an example that was highlighted in some of the recent coverage involved women being recruited online, right? Brought, as you said, to another country, oftentimes very, very far away, different language, different culture, different everything. And then they come to find out that they're carrying babies for things or purposes that they didn't agree to. The one description included the Thai surrogate who traveled 4,000 miles and found herself subject to an arrangement that was very, very different than the one that she expected. To read the story of what it was like to effectively have it was almost like fast food fertility. The way that they described, like, report your period, now take these pills, that was just this systematic, autonomous, almost robotically charged way of using people as incubators effectively. I
Yeah.
mean,
I mean, yeah, they were housed in hotels. Their passports were taken away. They couldn't leave. If they did anything wrong, they were charged an
yeah,
amount.
yeah.
If they needed to have like a polyp removed, they were being charged for things like that. So,
Yeah, it was like, "Well, you showed up and your equipment wasn't quite pristine, so you're gonna have to pay to get that up to snuff here." I mean, there was a lot of coercive behavior. One of the stories followed somebody who waited months and months of different delays. You and I know this, we've talked about this a million times on this show, about the amount of delays that occur in the fertility process because there's just so many unknowns that can happen. Having, them, because their payment or what have you is tied to these different milestones, they were selectively using that to keep them prisoners until they were ready for them.
yeah.
And these women would go like, "Should we go home? Like, I've gotten paid like $150 since I've been here for 6 months." They keep delaying, and these stories were compiled over the course of, I wanna say, like, a 7-month long journey of trying to uncover some of these patterns.
Yeah, yeah, and these patterns, they mirror other documented episodes globally.
Yeah.
Cambodia, Argentina, India, where they have weak or conflicting legal frameworks that enable these underground surrogacy markets, that involve trafficking, child trading, just outright deception of both the surrogates and the intended parents. So it's not either or. Both of them are being deceived. Both of them are being coerced. All of that.
The crazy part about that, Mary, is that they find a way, no matter what, to make her out to be the bad guys. There was a story reported by Associated Press in 2024 where 13 pregnant Filipino women were accused of illegally acting as surrogate moms in Cambodia after they'd been recruited online, and now they're back facing prison terms after they give birth, right? To me, it's astonishing the amount of depravity because, and this is why there have been so many laws of globally to ban commercial surrogacy because it's become, again, a commodity. We've only had the experience of surrogacy in a situation where we put a lot of guidelines on it. But I think to understand how this ultimately devolves and happens, you have to look at some of the structural drivers that drive towards exploitation, things like regulatory fragmentation. So, surrogacy legality, as you mentioned earlier, varies widely, not just by country, but even by US states. And as is the issue with other things, there is no federal surrogacy law. Right. And since states differ dramatically in enforcement and in sort of consumer protections, and with the heavy utilization of cross state travel for fertility care, meaning like it would not be uncommon if I'm here in Arizona, I am working remotely with a couple out of California and they have a surrogate in Montana, right? Like that's a
Mhm.
relatively common scenario. However, with the lack of a federal surrogacy law and all of that dramatic enforcement different, that fragmentation really creates this jurisdictional arbitrage, if you will, of reproductive tourism,
Sure.
which then increases the risk that turn into exploitation. The Coalition Against Trafficking in Women put out a special report in April of this year on this topic. I think another structural driver that moves this is the economic vulnerability. Like you said, women from economically disadvantaged backgrounds are probably going to view surrogacy as a financial opportunity and sort of stomach the medical risks or potential long term consequences or what have you, sort of put those to the side. And then the commercial incentives, right? The global commercial surrogacy industry is projected to grow rapidly. I think that we do have to consider again what will happen in the face of limited oversight, and that was something else that the report that the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women put out was that with limited oversight, commercial incentives really do drive an exploitative situation. And you and I have even seen we've been people that in this industry that have pushed back against similar potential drivers like from private equity, meaning things
Mhm.
like, well, if you get 100 IVF cycles, you get a bonus. No,
Mhm.
we are not
No.
bonusing based on cycles. That's never going to happen. I will walk out the door before we do that, and you would too, because we know that that is a slippery slope.
Absolutely.
So those are the driving forces. I think the biggest one is probably that economic vulnerability piece. Speaking on a broader level, it's the problem with so many societies around the world. Economic vulnerability is a choice. I mean, there's certainly enough money that exists in the world that wouldn't need to be the case. But unfortunately, societies are such that they often disenfranchise one group to improve another. And it's very unfortunate that women are so often taken advantage of because of all that we do have and can do, but
Yeah.
are sort of treated like second class, if you will. And especially now in the administration that we're living under. So it's a systematic dismantling, I guess, of different things to disadvantage different groups.
Yeah, I just pulled up the article because I remember there was one part that stuck out in my mind, and it was what you were saying, the market is expanding. We offer all this hope. And it says here that the various research firms estimate that a decade from now, the field is going to be worth $100 billion. And it goes on to say private equity considers the industry downturn resistant, that there is only a limited time to pursue treatment and people are willing to mortgage their houses to try.
And
Right.
that was astonishing to read that sentence, wasn't it?
Right. Yeah. So that was something that just really stood out in the article to me. We've seen our fair share of patients that will put out second mortgages and do whatever they can just to have the opportunity. And
Yeah,
sometimes with that hope and the opportunity, this is what how these types of surrogacies can happen. And they're kind of
right.
blinded by the fact that there's that hope of having a child, that they don't know that there's this sinister side of things. So that's something to, think about. Clinically, surrogacy carries its own risks, right? These women may have pregnancy complications, psychological stress. I mean, that can come from any pregnancy, but then you add in this whole deception and coercion, and you have an ethical crisis on your hands.
No, 1,000%. And from a legal perspective, obviously, the sale of children is clearly prohibited under every international human rights instrument that exists. And yet, when a contract effectively involves the transferring of a child for some payment or remuneration, then if you don't have rigorous protections and oversight, I mean, you quickly go into the situation that the Times piece encounters. And in many US states, surrogacy contracts can be enforced without requiring background checks or like on independent parents or home studies, and that's adoption law, right? Like that there's some typical safeguards there. But when surrogacy contracts don't have those things, in my view, the lack of safeguards has real consequences. This is a tough thing to grapple with because there is good and bad in everything. And we've talked about this like with the RRM movement, like these things are born out of like a genuine desire for better, but and to try to help everybody. But I think, yeah, there's just not enough. There's especially globally, there's just not enough safeguards. And I think that in highly exploitative societies, that is the absolute worst possible thing that you could bring into that scenario because it's so and it's a bit disturbing, right, to hear it called like a multi-billion dollar, like,
Mhm.
would you call it recession proof or not that, but like
Recession. Yeah.
downturn
Yeah.
proof. That's
Yeah.
it's kind of an interesting, again, commoditization of the fact that we have to procreate to exist. Anyway, I digress on that one.
Yeah. I also point out that even with the legality, the legal documents that we do here in the US, are stories. There are those stories out there, parents that do not show up to the hospital to pick up their child, and the gestational carrier has to take that child home. And that happens. And then there's a whole legal fighting ensued because there were legal documents that were signed, but we've seen stories here and there. And sometimes when it hits the media, it kind of blows up like, oh, this happens all the time. It doesn't happen all the time. But
Right.
it happens. So
And
even
when it
with
does
the
happen,
strict.
even one instance of it is a major
Yes.
ordeal.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Yeah. So that's my thing about the legality thing. So while systemic analysis is crucial, we need to remember the individual women and children at the center of these stories. The
Yeah.
surrogates who believed they were entering in a supportive clinical arrangement only to be silenced or stripped of their own agency, and intended parents feeling betrayed, defrauded. There's that story reported in the Post where authorities went
California.
in and they was it California? Okay, I
Yeah.
thought it was, but I wasn't sure. But it was
Mhm.
where authorities removed like dozens of children from a home because of suspected abuse by caregivers arranged through surrogacy schemes. They literally had so many children in their house and they were doing surrogacy all over the place, like different clinics and all this stuff. And it raised the question about the vetting, oversight, welfare safeguards because
Yeah.
how does that happen? It was like 21 kids or something like
Yeah,
that.
effectively, it's
Yeah.
from my high level understanding of that, of that story that the couple had, a couple dozen fertilized embryos. Like they had made embryos and had these embryos stored, um, at a clinic. And then it sounds like they farmed out their surrogacy to like a bunch of different people at the same time. So I have seen this once or twice in my experience where somebody is using a gestational carrier and they want to kind of have two gestational carriers at once
Hmm.
because they want the kids so badly that they just want them now. But this situation was effectively, they had 15 kids, I think it was, that they had farmed out and had born via surrogacy, and they were mostly toddlers, infants, like little kids.
Yeah.
And I mean, there are stories of from women that are fighting for custody of, children that they carried and bonded with, and revealing this very, very emotional and legally complex behind the scenes understanding beyond the binary, like win lose narratives that make it into the public discourse. Like you said, like what else are we seeing? And so that takes us to what we do a lot, and that's talk about advocacy and how does this relate to how we can be effective.
Yeah, what should reproductive medicine and policy advocates, what should we prioritize? I have a list of things like stronger safeguards akin to adoption. I think we mentioned that earlier. Mandatory background checks, psychosocial evaluations, legal protections that place the child's welfare and the surrogate's autonomy front and center. International cooperation, right? Cross-border reproductive arrangements require, harmonized standards to prevent this exploitation that we were reading about. We just need to have that cooperation internationally. Transparency in clinics and agencies, independent reporting systems and registries for surrogacy arrangements could help monitor outcomes and complications and such. Support for surrogates' right to health and informed consent at every stage of the process. And I think that's the most important thing is informed consent, right? In the story, these women were not given informed consent.
Right.
They were told what to do. They may have signed things that stated they were informed consent, but they were not. Again, doctors were not speaking in the same language that they were. Didn't have a translation service. They didn't even allow them to use a simple tools such as Google Translate, anything like that. So, it all comes down to both sides need to have full informed consent and the ability to say no.
Yeah, no, that being the most important piece of the entire thing is like and that's where this is so gray because there are instances where, many instances where a surrogate is adequately informed, fully consenting, the process goes off without a hitch, and everything is happy and wonderful afterwards. And the arrangement that they all thought it would be and agreed upon is what it is. And we move on. But unfortunately, that's not always the case. These aren't theoretical concerns. I mean, these are backed by international human rights bodies that have called attention to the exploitation in commercial surrogacy and the need for systemic reform across the board. But there again, pregnancy is a dangerous ordeal. You really don't realize how dicey pregnancy and delivery really is when you think about the massive amount of blood volume that a mother's body can take on and offload, and the hormonal requirements, and just, I mean, the entire thing is miraculous. And yet you having any commercial nature in such a thing. I mean, and so that would go to is all surrogacy bad? Is there a case where if it's commercial, it's bad? So let's say you say, "Hey, Elizabeth, I want to be your surrogate. You don't have to pay me anything," and we go through, but is that right either? I don't know. That's where, like, let's talk through sort of like some of the balance. These are the questions here that help us to provide some balance to the topic.
Yeah. And again, I think about certain patients of mine over the years, not just stational carriers, but patients who delivered themselves. And there is a process that fertility clinics have to go through. We have to call patients after they deliver and we have to get information because we have reported to SART. And sometimes you get stories of like, oh, I had gestational diabetes and I had preeclampsia and I had to deliver early and it went away, or it didn't go away and I had to be treated for a certain amount of time, after that. So yeah, I mean, it's not just like, oh, I want to have your child, or I want to, there are certain understanding that the gestational carrier has to understand the risks, right? It does come down to a lot of risks that happen. I mean, I had a patient who delivered, saw her baby and passed away because she had an amniotic embolism. And, I just, such a horrible story. And we were, the only reason we found out is 'cause the finance department was trying to get their payment on storage of their embryos, of
Oh,
their other
that's
embryos. I
terrible.
mean, that was the only reason that we found out, and it was horrible. And these are huge risks that these women take, and it's not something lightly to make that decision. Although they want to in their heart to be able to do that, there has to be all of that. Going back to your question, is all surrogacy bad? I don't. I no. I think all. There is not, there are bad situations for surrogacy. In the case of the story that we read, the read that we did, the article, that's pretty bad. But all in all, not all surrogacy is bad. I agree. As long as everybody is on the same page, there is the oversight, there's the protections for both parties. So we just don't want to have women who are vulnerable, children who are at risk. And how do we balance that reproductive autonomy with safeguards?
No, that's a core tension, right? Bodily autonomy is utterly fundamental,
Hmm.
but autonomy requires necessarily informed consent and very supportive structures that don't include economic desperation or opaque contracts or things like that, but just truly informed. And I think that we in the US have tried to do a really solid job at creating our own standards, even when maybe there, like we talked about, there's no federal law that governs this. And yet I think that our field is a group of particularly diligent people that very deeply care about the facts and about having evidence-based care lead the way. And so, I think that we have done a decent job, but we've also failed. We know this. Like you said, like we're surrogates where the intended parent doesn't show up to pick up the baby. Again, these are the outliers, but these are huge in terms of the implications on generations to come. I can't, and that's some of what we grapple with too. We can't, when patients go do like a psychological consult before entering into one of these agreements, the therapist does their best to tease out all of the potential risks or scenarios or complications or things like that. But I mean, I can even remember through the course of our adoptive process, a lot of the questions that you would sort of get asked, and there's a lot of what ifs. And
Hmm.
so, yeah, so I think that we balance reproductive autonomy with safeguards by always focusing first and foremost on the patient, and the patient is the one undergoing the medical treatment. So, and when a pregnancy occurs, having to consider both of those lives and what safeguards need to be in place first and foremost. And I think to enter into that agreement, once there is a baby that's growing, I mean, there's yeah, it's really fundamental. And it's why you saw the situations that devolve around the world, and this this very dark story about how it
Hmm.
can go so wrong.
Absolutely. And
So
they take advantage of those intended parents by saying, hey, if you come here, we can, the cost is going to be so much better than if you
right.
stayed in your own home country.
Yep.
And come here, and they never, see actually what's going on, and they never meet their carrier. And if they do, they don't speak the same languages, right? Come
Yeah.
from two different countries.
Yeah.
So they can't connect, they can't talk about certain things, that, you know, if there's a situation, you know, it needs to have a red flag, right? Red flags all over the
And
place.
any question marks, the more question marks there are, the redder the flag,
Yes.
right? And so
Yeah.
and trying to help also bring awareness to this, right? To help educate women around the world that, like I've noticed in, there's I forget what the chain is, but in the bathrooms, there's like a placard that says like if you can't leave freely, like they have them in some airports, like you
Yep.
are a
Oh, yeah.
victim of trafficking, because you have to remember that there are people from around the world who do not see that as an aberrant behavior.
Yeah.
And so, and again, incumbent upon us that, if you can't leave on your own behest, if you can't make your own decisions, that is not a safe situation.
Right.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, at the end of the day, yeah, we'll link some resources and whatnot in the show notes so you guys can dig deeper. Yeah, at the end of the day, we just want to call these things out and make sure that we're bringing you even. I mean, such a hard topic to talk about because, and I'm sure we'll get some comments like, but it is. There's not a. It's all good or all bad.
Right.
There's a lot of
Exactly.
good in it and there's a lot of bad in it. We're the ones with the ability to make that change.
Right. Right. So, basically, to everybody, stay engaged, ask questions, advocate for ethical reproductive medicine. That's what we do, right? Hold systems accountable when harm appears, you know?
Yep.
So that's us. That's us in our
That's what we
little
do.
that's what we do. All right.
No, that's what we
So
do.
that
Just hold people accountable. You know what though? It's working. If you're tired, you're doing it right.
mhm,
There's been so much. I think we have one or two more episodes this year, but we're excited to be on the 17th episode of this program, trying to
yeah.
bring just facts and raw. We do think we're funny, so that's kind of great. Whether or not
I
we're
know I'm
actually
funny.
funny,
I'm just kidding.
I was like, whether we're actually funny is debatable. No, we're actually quite funny. But no, I think that people are hungry for like just the reality of some of these topics. And I say all the time, we grew up in a time where if they said, don't talk about religion, don't talk about politics, don't talk about money. Now we're in this time and place in society, we're like, oh, we really can't talk about these things without, and so that's what we're here for, is to call attention to that stuff. So next week we'll be back with another hot topic. And until then, stay spicy, stay engaged, and stay spicy. I like that. All right, next
Thank you.
time.
All right. Very good.